Pues yo creo que cada uno tiene su filosofía y su manera de ver lo que es el fútbol, ¿no? Por ejemplo, el fútbol para mí es mi vida, porque el fútbol me ha dado todo. Y me encantaría que hubiese una investigación profunda de quién fue esa persona, porque esa persona no hay que hacerle una estatua, no hay que hacerle un monumento, sino debe de quedar ahí en la historia como uno de los grandes genios que ha habido en el mundo. Porque así, quien inventó la penicilina, quien inventó el teléfono, quien inventó la televisión, la gravedad, esos grandes genios de la humanidad, el que inventó el fútbol, hay que adorarle como si fuera un dios.
The origins of football is a history of signs and symbols, gods and games. Sports have long been the provenance of history's great civilizations, and it is through these that the game we know as football was conceived, shaped, and refined. "3,400 years ago, in the country we now know as Mexico, Mesoamericans played the first team sport using a ball made of rubber. It was a game the Mayans later adopted. For them, the ball symbolized the sun, its power, its fertility, and in an act that foreshadowed football's dark and violent history, the losing captain would be sacrificed to the gods. The Chinese proved more forgiving. Tsu, a popular sport of the Han dynasty, celebrated life, not death. Around 136 BC, Li Yu, a local poet, said of it, "The ball is round, the playing field square, just like the sky and the earth. The ball flies over us like the sun, while the two teams face each other." The game spread to Japan and was renamed Kamari.
"今から約1400年ぐらい前に中国から仏教とかその他の文化とともに日本に入ってまいりました。それが大体起源ですね。
Highly ritualized, Kamari was more ceremonial than the informal game that later developed.
蹴鞠は、蹴鞠のその晴れ会をする前に必ずこの鞠を神前に備えます。そして、蹴鞠を下げてきて枝鞠の儀、時鞠の儀というものをいたしますが、その時には枝役がやはり、五穀豊穣、世界平和と、そういうことを記念して、それから鞠を蹴ります。蹴鞠は、だいたい6名ないし8名で蹴ります。そして、蹴鞠の最大の特徴は勝負がありません。勝ち負けがありません。その8人が仲良く楽しく蹴り合うと、そういう楽しく和気あいあいと蹴るというのが蹴鞠の精神になっています。
While the Japanese invested Kamari with a calming sense of the spiritual, the Romans saw their games as limited warfare, a struggle, often to the death. Chariot racers and their teams had their own partisan fans, They wore the colors of their team and sometimes fought with opposition supporters. But the Romans didn't play ball sports in the arenas. Instead, such games were played for exercise and military training.
I legionari romani giocavano l'arpasto, che era un gioco che loro avevano conosciuto dai greci. I romani se ne appropriarono perché era un gioco che si contendeva la palla, si rubava. E si dividevano in 4 linee: gli astati, i veliti, i principi e i triari. Quindi 4 linee che sarebbero poi gli attaccanti, i mediani, i difensori e i portieri.
This game, so familiar tactically, would have been taken to Britain during the Roman conquest. It's debatable whether they initiated or indeed influenced the games played on the island. But what is known is that 1,000 years after the Romans left, the Britons were playing a variety of ball sports, foremost of which were the games of folk football. Usually played on the Shrovetide holiday or at Christmas and New Year, such games were steeped in pagan ritual. Their true origins veiled by one of the oldest, grisliest, yet best known football myths, that the first balls were human heads.
Sometimes an old custom has its origin in a source we cannot define or know, and can be looked on almost as a secretion of history. There's this old story about Tusker, a petty tyrant who oppressed the people, who bullied them, and eventually people rose up in revolt against him. He realized that the game was up, it was time to go, so he fled to the mainland of Scotland. However, a local champion decided that the thing to do was to put an end to this forever. Eventually he caught up with Tusker at the old city of Perth. He slew him in single combat and cut his head off. And the local champion tied Tusker's head to the pommel of his saddle and rode north to Orkney. And as he did, these teeth cut into his leg and eventually infected it, and he got ill and more ill, and eventually went septic. However, with his dying strength, he managed to get back to Kirkwall, and he climbed up the Mercat Cross in front of the cathedral, and there he threw the grisly head to the waiting people below to show them that their oppressor was indeed dead. He then died. And so infuriated were the people at the champion's death that they kicked around the head of Tusker in their anger and grief.
The legend, whether true or not, is still enacted year in, year out by the people of Kirkwall, Scotland, making it one of the last strongholds of a game which for hundreds of years dominated Britain. The game itself is remarkably similar to other long-abandoned folk matches played on the island. The pitch is the entire town. The players number in their hundreds. The goals are local landmarks a mile apart. One goal was generally all it took to win the game, although that could take a whole day. In Kirkwall, 2 sides compete, the up the gates and the down the gates. Their struggle for the ball, or bar, is deeply symbolic.
The tradition was for a long time that if the down the gates managed to get the bar, which was the fertilizing influence of the sun it was the sun and its fertilizing influence, and they threw it into the waters of the harbour, then that would bring good fishing. And if the Applegates got the bar to their goal, and they were mostly farmers, that would bring good crops, particularly good potatoes. And there was a small town in Norway that until recently phoned every New Year's Day to see which way the bar had gone, so they could assess whether or not there was going to be good fishing in the months ahead. In terms of roughness, there are no rules. It's hard, it's a hard physical contest. Perhaps sometimes old scores are settled, but generally speaking, there is little gratuitous violence.
For all its rough and tumble, folk football was more often than not folklore. Not so for the Calcio Historica played in Florence, Italy. Here was a game which directly acknowledged its debt to the ancient Roman game of harpastum.
Questo gioco, tanto in uso fra i legionari romani, fu introdotto anche nella colonia florentia. Con l'andar del tempo i fiorentini se ne appropriarono.
Calcio's history is as rich in antiquity as any of the English folk games. Florentines proudly recall the legend of the sedio, an infamous match played in defiance of its enemies.
Nel 1530 i fiorentini erano assediati dalle truppe imperiali di Carlo V e per non interrompere l'usanza di carnevale, di giocare per carnevale, il 17 febbraio giocarono una partita a scherno degli assedianti che ormai credevano Firenze soccombente.
Such bravado typifies a game infused with violence. A game where men test themselves and master both their fear and their opponent. In the sedio of 1530, one player became the embodiment of these virtues, Dante da Castiglione.
Una regola fondamentale era quella che la palla doveva essere sempre in movimento. Il morticino degli Antinori non mollava il pallone, lo teneva con sé. E per il forte Dante da Castiglione prese calciante e pallone, che non era fermo perché era in movimento in quanto lo teneva in braccio, e portò fino alla rete avversaria e scagliò dentro calciante e pallone, marcando la caccia.
Calcio was a game adored by all Florentines, yet it was also riven with distinctions of class and social standing.
Mentre i nobili lo giocavano nelle maggiori piazze, con intensa partecipazione di pubblico, viceversa il popolo si intratteneva a questo ludo proprio in considerazione che era il loro gioco e veniva praticato da tutte le parti, tant'è che girando per le strade di Firenze si può ancora vedere su palazzi o vicino alle chiese delle targhe di marmo o di pietra dove i signori 8 di guardia e balia proibivano di giocare appunto vicino alle chiese oppure per le strade a questo gioco spontaneo che tutti i fiorentini giocavano.
Restrictions such as these were commonplace in Britain. Shops and homes were regularly damaged as the players rampaged through towns. Many died from their wounds.
You can almost write the history of the game folk game of football in terms of people trying to stop it, of local authority issuing edicts, royals issuing proclamations against it, colleges trying to stop their members playing it, because it's turbulent, because it's violent, because it poses a threat to law and order on that particular day when the games take place.
As early as 1314, King Edward II banned football in London, proclaiming, "Forasmuch as there is a great noise in the city, caused by hustling over large balls, from which many evils might arise, which, God forbid, we commend and forbid such a game to be used in the city in future." Edward's descendants were equally dismissive. Henry V waged war against it, as did Henry VIII, who believed it was distracting young men from their archery. Yet neither could stop football being played. And when, in the 19th century, football finally received a fatal blow, it was not an act of man, but of machinery.
The threat that folk football posed to the rise of an urban society in the early 19th century was serious in a way. You can't have the old games that have been played in a kind of pre-industrial environment played in the great expanding urban industrial centres. Local towns and cities pass acts and pieces of legislation to curb the old traditional games from being played in their own towns and on their streets. This is a world where football has to find a new location to be played. The old folk game is dead.
The game was rescued from oblivion by the public schools of England, who were in turn endeavouring to save themselves. In the 1850s, most were struggling with falling admissions and violent pupils. Students rioted, burnt down classrooms, and attacked locals. The teachers, many of them vicars, were horrified.
Given the mentalities of pupils at the time, and given their lack of personal self-control, that frame of mind had to be changed. And so emerged as a form of social control the process of turning hooligans into heroes. And the essence of reform was the playing field. And the rationale behind this was very simple. If you beat hell out of each other on the games field, you weren't quite so predisposed to beating hell out of the villagers or the local inhabitants.
Religion became the backbone of this sporting revolution. Muscular Christianity, the belief that sports were a useful aspect of religious training, taught boys that a fit body bred a fit mind, that fair play and teamwork on the playing field promoted moral fortitude. Each school evolved its own version of football. Some, like Harrow, favoured a kicking game, while others, such as Rugby School, were allowed to handle, run, and hack down opponents. This rich diversity was to become the starting point for the modern game.
I think the public school teams firstly kept the games going, and then probably the real significance is at the moments at which public school boys went to university together, or when they left school, left university, and wanted to carry on playing the games, and therefore needed an agreed form of the games to play, and that's what leads us into the codification of football.
On the 26th of October 1863, 11 London clubs met at the Freemasons' Tavern to discuss a universal set of rules. Having agreed to call themselves the Football Association, an impasse was reached. The supporters of the Rugby Code opposed any law which might prevent